For centuries, the Huns have stood in history like a thunderclap, sudden, violent, and terrifying. Roman writers describe them as if they had erupted from the edge of the known world, a people so foreign that even their appearance seemed to defy explanation. They were painted as monsters on horseback, an unstoppable force from the distant east. And for generations, one explanation felt obvious. They must have come from Mongolia, a vast horde riding west from the Asian steppe, sweeping across continents in a single, overwhelming migration. It's dramatic, it's simple, and it turns out it's wrong. Because now, ancient DNA is challenging one of the most iconic origin stories in European history. And the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating than the legend ever was. When the Huns first appeared on Rome's frontier in the late 4th century, they didn't just arrive quietly. They detonated the political order of Europe. Gothic tribes fled before them in terror. Roman defenses buckled. Refugees poured across borders. The map of Europe began to shift under the pressure of their advance. To the Romans, the Huns seemed alien, not just politically, but biologically. Writers describe them with exaggerated features, strange customs, and an almost supernatural savagery. They weren't just enemies, they were portrayed as something other. And from the very beginning, one question echoed through history. Where did they come from? What scientists are about to uncover would overturn a theory historians believed for nearly 200 years. Centuries later, scholars searching for answers looked east, far east. They noticed similarities between the Huns and an earlier nomadic empire recorded in Chinese sources, the Xiongnu, who had once dominated the Mongolian steppe. The connection was seductive. Powerful steppe horsemen, mounted archers, nomadic confederations. The pieces seemed to fit. So the theory took hold. The Huns were the descendants of the Xiongnu, pushing westward across Eurasia in a delayed but massive migration. It became one of those historical ideas that feels so right it stops being questioned. But there was always a problem, a silence. Nearly 300 years separated the collapse of the Xiongnu Empire and the first appearance of the Huns in Europe. No clear migration trail, no continuous records, just a vast chronological and geographical gap across the steppe. And into that silence, assumptions grew, until science arrived to test them. In the last decade, ancient DNA has given historians a new kind of evidence, one that doesn't rely on legends, secondhand accounts, or artifact styles. Researchers began sequencing genomes from burials across Eurasia, including individuals associated with both the Xiongnu and the European Huns. This was the moment of truth. If the Huns were truly a transplanted Mongolian population, their DNA would show a strong, consistent East Asian signature. But that's not what science has found. The first genetic results didn't just challenge the old story, they made it impossible to defend. Instead, the data told a story no one expected. Yes, some individuals buried in Hunnic period graves in Europe did carry clear East Asian ancestry. Genetic markers linked them to populations from the eastern steppe, including regions once ruled by the Xiongnu. So the old theory wasn't pure fantasy. But here's where everything changes. Those individuals were a minority, a small fraction. The vast majority of people buried in Hunnic contexts, especially in Central Europe, had mixed ancestry. Their genomes showed combinations of West Eurasian, Central Asian, and steppe lineages. Many looked genetically closer to local European populations than to people from Mongolia. This wasn't a single migrating nation. It wasn't a uniform ethnic group sweeping across Eurasia. It was something far more fluid. A confederation, a moving alliance of different peoples, drawn together by power, opportunity, and survival. As they moved west, they didn't replace populations, they absorbed them. They forged alliances, they intermarried, they expanded like a growing network, not a marching tribe. And the deeper scientists looked, the more the idea of a pure Hun people completely fell apart. Geneticists discovered long-shared DNA segments linking a few European Hun elites to individuals from the old Xiongnu Empire. These weren't distant, vague connections. They were close enough to suggest real ancestral ties across generations. This tells us something incredible. A lineage of Eastern steppe elites really did move west, but instead of bringing an entire nation with them, they became a ruling layer within a much larger mixed society. Power may have come from the east, but the people came from everywhere. This explains a historical mystery that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Roman sources describe Hun leaders as exotic and foreign, yet archaeology shows that Hunnic society in Europe quickly blended with local cultures. Their empire ruled over Germanic groups, interacted constantly with Rome, and adapted to European environments. Now we know why. They were already mixed. Even their graves reveal the diversity. Some burials contain clear steppe traditions, horse gear, Eastern-style weapons, nomadic ornaments. Others look completely local. The genetic data mirrors this cultural mosaic almost perfectly. The Hunnic Empire wasn't built on shared blood. It was built on shared allegiance. Charismatic leaders like Attila acted as the gravitational center of a vast political network. Different groups orbited that power, contributing warriors, families, and traditions. In other words, being a Hun wasn't about where you were born, it was about who you followed. But that kind of empire is fragile. When Attila died, the alliance fractured. Without the central force holding it together, the confederation splintered into its components. What had looked like a single, unstoppable people dissolved into many. Not because a nation fell, because a coalition broke apart. And this isn't just a story of the Huns, it's the story of the steppe itself. Time and again, genetic research shows that steppe empires were built from diversity. Scythians, Turks, Mongols, their identities were fluid, shaped by mobility, politics, and culture more than strict ancestry. The Huns were an early example of this pattern. Their name described a political identity, not a biological one. Which means the biggest surprise of all is this: the Huns didn't conquer Europe as strangers. By the time they arrived, they were already part European themselves. To be Hun was to belong to a system of power, not to share a single origin. So, were the Huns from Mongolia? Partly, indirectly, through elite lineages and distant ancestral threads. But they were also from Central Asia, from the Western Steppe, from Europe itself. They were the product of centuries of migration, mixture, and adaptation across the greatest landmass on Earth. The old image of a single foreign horde crashing into Europe is dramatic. The real story is deeper. It's about how identities form in motion, how cultures grow through contact, how history is shaped not by isolated peoples, but by vast human networks stretching across continents. And in the Huns' DNA, we can finally see what ancient writers never could. They weren't just invaders from one distant homeland, they were a living bridge between East and West. A reminder that the past is rarely as simple as the legends we inherit. And if this discovery changes how you see ancient history, imagine what else DNA is about to reveal. Subscribe to GenealogyX and step into the next hidden chapter written in our genes.